Don't lie to yourself. It gave you pleasure.
Nightmare Creatures 2 is an action-based hack-and-slash horror game developed by Callisto Entertainment and published by Konami. The game released in the year 2000 for Sony PlayStation and Sega Dreamcast, and is the sequel to 1997's Nightmare Creatures. The game takes place in 1934 in locations around London and Paris. Adam Crowley, occultist and main antagonist from the previous game, returns as the main villain in Nightmare Creatures 2.
She needed me. My nightmare was just about to begin.
Crowley is responsible for creating a vast race of mutants known as Nightmare Creatures, which he is using to take out a group of monster hunters known as the Circle. Here in Nightmare Creatures 2, the player will take control of Herbert Wallace, a patient of Crowley's genetics hospital. Wallace breaks out of captivity armed with an axe. Wallace is the main character here, looking like a Marilyn Manson doppelganger. Wallace sets his sights on Crowley, as most of the game you'll find yourself right on the heels of Crowley and Wallace's friend Rachel, who you will occasionally run into throughout the game's story. Nightmare Creatures 2 features licensed music from the artist Rob Zombie, most of which is played during cutscenes and in the intro of the game, with the rest of the music being composed by Frederick Mote. Gameplay here is similar to the first game, with a hack-and-slash style combat that utilizes combinations. Wallace is equipped with his main weapon of use being an axe, which is his primary weapon. But, like the previous game, the player can find many useful items laying around, with pretty much every usable item from the previous game making a return here. With the adrenaline bar from the previous game being abandoned, and new fatality moves being added, which can be performed on weakened enemies to finish them off. However, Wallace is the only playable character here in Nightmare Creatures 2. Nightmare Creatures 2 features 16 levels that can be lengthy, as Nightmare Creatures 2 encourages more exploration and puzzle solving than the previous game, with Wallace now having the ability to swim and push and move objects to progress an area. Although most levels in the game are fairly linear, but can be tricky and time consuming on the first playthrough. Boss fights make a return here in Nightmare Creatures 2, but lack the intensity of the first game. In the original game, boss fights were somewhat epic and memorable, with awesome gothic heavy metal music that would ramp up during the boss fight sequences. But here in Nightmare Creatures 2, they are somewhat lackluster, with many boss fights happening towards the end of a level, but sometimes it was hard to decipher whether or not you were fighting a boss, or if the game was simply introducing a new monster enemy to the player. As many of these boss fights weren't memorable, especially the final monster in the game. The player just simply has to set 2 dynamite bombs near the creature in a timed sequence to end the game. So overall, this game really dropped the ball when it comes to boss fights when compared to the original. One thing, however, this game does is carry over the great atmosphere that the previous game introduces, with great ambient music pieces that would really do a great job of setting the tone and mood for most of the levels in the game. Nightmare Creatures 2 also adds more ambiance by including more environmental noises and sounds into its background that really sets a dark mood for the game. The game also features much more cutscenes, as the previous game barely had any at all, with many of these cutscenes appearing either before or after a level was complete. Creature design is once again done very well here in Nightmare Creatures 2, with each monster looking more terrifying than the previous. But I do have a bone to pick with some of the creatures' sounds and noises, as I feel the previous game had epic creepy noises for each creature. I'll never forget the werewolves from the previous game, but here in Nightmare Creatures 2, many of the creatures just sound silly, with the exception of a few that manage to sound creepy enough. Nightmare Creatures 2 released towards the end of the original PlayStation's lifecycle, as the game really pushed that console's limitations, and the game performed a little bit better on the Sega Dreamcast, but still had its fair share of issues. Compared to the first game, this game's overall gameplay is slower, but less clunky than the original, as one of the original game's main critiques being its clunky controls and overall character movement. However, the overall gameplay in Nightmare Creatures 2 is improved, but however the PlayStation version of the game received mixed reviews alongside the Sega Dreamcast version. Many compare Nightmare Creatures games to From Software's Bloodborne, which is a fair comparison when we're talking about overall theme and atmosphere, but these are two very different titles, with very different gameplay overall. But both games do share similarities in combat style, as both games make you rely on timing the enemy's attack with a counterattack, with every creature being a little bit different. Overall, the Nightmare Creatures games were a blast, and I really enjoyed looking back at both games. If you're not familiar with this channel, in a previous video, we looked back at the original Nightmare Creatures. And so, I felt the need to also look back at this game as well. I personally have more memories of playing the original game, and that's the one I personally consider the best, but many people really love Nightmare Creatures 2, as it does seem to be the overall fan favorite between the two games. All in all, these are both two classic horror games from that era that deserve some love, and they also deserve to be remembered. I highly recommend playing both of these titles if you haven't already, especially if you love horror games. If you like this video, please be sure to hit that like button down below, as it really helps out the channel. And if you would like to see more like this, visit our channel and consider subscribing, as we do more videos just like this. But until next time, this has been McKiLL TV's Nightmare Creatures 2, a retrospective.
Rachel was safe, the horror defeated. But while I savored the brief taste of victory, I was all too aware that Crowley, hidden in some dark and sordid place, continued to weave his evil web of darkness.